Hello everyone, in this video I will be recapping the chapter 65 of the manhwa Revenge of the Iron-Blooded Sword Hound. The next day, Vikir began to make his way towards the grand banquet hall. After several minutes, he arrived at the door of the grand banquet hall, which was guarded by two guards who were creating tension in the atmosphere. Vikir started to approach the door and stared at it intently. After several seconds, he began to slowly open the door, further increasing the tension in the room. Upon opening the door, a bright light dazzled his face. Once the intensity of the light subsided, he saw Hugo sitting on the seat of honor. Beside him was his butler. On Hugo's left side sat his children and on his right side sat his brothers. The butler informed everyone that Vikir van Baskerville was also going to attend the grand banquet as ordered by the head of the family. Everyone turned towards the direction where Vikir was. First Setla Baskerville turned, who had dark circles under his eyes and looked quite tired, but despite this, he smiled at him pleasantly. Then Osiris turned, who simply looked at Vikir with one eye. Then Highborough, Middleborough and Lowborough turned, who started looking at him with admiration. Then the Great Dane turned around, who was somewhat surprised to see Vikir attending the grand banquet. And finally Boston Terrier turned around, and while resting his head on his fist simply smiled at seeing Vikir. Vikir placed a hand on his chest and closed his eyes to thank Hugo for the invitation to the grand banquet. Hugo stared at him intently, and while his eyes were shining, he called Vikir son and asked him to come to the table and sit next to his brothers. He approached and sat at the table, and the grand banquet began. First, everyone started with the main course, which was meat. They all started eating without saying a word, creating tension in the atmosphere. The servants stood behind Boston Terrier's chair and watched as the tension in the room began to increase every second. The first person to break the tension was Boston Terrier Le Baskerville, commander of the Pitbull Order. His plate had 4 pieces of sliced meat. He asked everyone if the meat was undercooked. Hugo became somewhat confused, looked at Boston Terrier, and asked him if he didn't like meat. Boston Terrier smiled and replied that it wasn't what he had meant to say. He then pointed with his hand to the person sitting next to him, who was struggling to cut the meat as it was quite raw. Boston Terrier explained to Hugo that he was referring to the meat on the plate next to him. The person sitting next to him was Great Dane Le Baskerville, commander of the Mastiff Order, who was a bit annoyed. He asked Boston Terrier what else he was dissatisfied with. Boston Terrier stared at him and replied that he had never thought he would eat raw meat. He also added that it was as if he was trying to eat his adorable nephew raw. Great Dane also stared at him and admitted that Vikir seemed cute, but reminded him that he too was his nephew, and as an uncle, it was natural to guide his nephew on the right path. Boston Terrier pointed his finger at Vikir and asked Great Dane why the right path involved throwing a child to a mastiff. Great Dane replied that this path was much better than getting involved with a stupid and boring pit bull. While Vikir looked at his uncles, he thought to himself that as expected, they had come with the intention of recruiting him. Among the 7 knights representing Baskerville, 2 of them wanted to recruit him for the Pitbull and Mastiff Knights. Before regressing, Vikir would have liked it since they were the elite with guaranteed success. While he was taking a piece of meat to his mouth, he looked at his uncles disdainfully and thought that now they simply seemed like a bunch of stray dogs. Hugo interrupted the conversation between Great Dane and Boston Terrier. Then while the butler was pouring him some wine in a glass, he explained to them that the younger brothers were always noble and arrogant, and he also added that the head of the house was happy to see them showing affection for the young master. While Vikir was watching his father drink from the glass of wine, he thought that the chief steward always gave a hopeful interpretation, and he also thought that Hugo enjoyed watching his younger brothers fight. Boston Terrier caught his attention and addressed him as his dear nephew to ask if he had spent the last 2 years in La Rouge et La Noire mountains. He also asked how many barbarians and monsters he had killed. He asked him to share his forest experiences with him. Great Dane also caught Vikir's attention to tell him that he was also concerned about knowing how his nephew had spent that time in the dangerous forest, and he also added that he was curious about his growth in the forest. Hugo interrupted the conversation and asked his brothers not to pressure him and asked them to let him eat. Great Dane asked Hugo if he felt curious, and Boston Terrier explained that he couldn't resist curiosity, so he hurried back as soon as possible to attend the grand banquet. At that moment, Hugo got angry and asked both of them that it was enough already. Upon hearing this, Great Dane and Boston Terrier felt the immense pressure coming from their older brother's words. Hugo stood up from his chair with a killer aura, and while holding a piece of meat with his fork, he reminded them again that he didn't like to say things twice. Both calmed down and decided to stop talking anymore. But at that moment, Vikir also stood up from his chair, and while looking at his 2 uncles, he explained to everyone that it wasn't difficult to prove his achievements. Upon seeing that Vikir had gotten up, Hugo looked at him and reminded him that he had traveled a long distance. He asked if it wouldn't be exhausting to make it all the way to the drill hall. Vikir looked at Hugo and replied that it was fine. Then, he extended his hand and touched the table, explaining to everyone that he could showcase his skills anytime and anywhere. He also asked them if everyday life wasn't an extension of training. He caught the attention of his uncle Boston Terrier and revealed that there was too much wine in his glass. Then, he caught the attention of his uncle Great Dane and disclosed that his steak was not well done, leaving both surprised and somewhat confused. While he was touching the table, he began to concentrate, and after several seconds, his finger started to release a bit of his mana. Vikir directed that mana towards the wine glass and the steak plate, causing the steak to cook perfectly and making sure the wine glass had the perfect amount of wine. Great Dane pierced the meat with his fork and was impressed to see that it was cooked perfectly. Boston Terrier took the wine glass and upon seeing that it had the perfect amount of wine, started laughing. Boston Terrier explained to everyone that when Vikir placed his hand on the table, he had used mana to cook the meat and heat the wine. He was surprised to see that he had reached the intermediate level of graduation at 17 years old, when normally one would reach that stage at 33 years old. He also shared his thoughts that his older brother Hugo must feel proud to have a son who had mastered all these techniques. Hugo simply drank from his wine glass and listened to the praises of his younger brother towards his son. Vikir looked towards High Burrow, Middle Burrow, and Low Burrow and thought that this was very strange because 2 years ago, he thought he had revealed his abilities as a mid-ranker graduate when he fought against Madam. He never thought that anyone would know until now. He looked at the 3 boys who were looking at him with admiration and thought they must know about his abilities. He also started to wonder why they didn't inform anyone. At that moment, someone caught his attention by calling him little brother to praise him for working very hard. The person who had praised him was Osiris Le Baskerville, first in line for succession, and the Baskerville family's eldest son. While holding his wine glass, he once again praised Vikir for doing a good job and also asked him to continue working harder in the future. Vikir, somewhat confused, thanked his older brother and began to wonder if Osiris had just praised him. Osiris was the first successor in line for the current Baskerville family and also resembled Hugo the most. Vikir still couldn't believe that Osiris was praising him. He started wondering if he was being evaluated by him. Then another person who had just placed his wine glass on the table told everyone that it was surprising to see the older brother praising his younger brother. This person was Set Le Baskerville, second in line for succession, and the Baskerville family's second oldest son. He looked at Vikir and revealed to everyone that this was the first time he had seen older brother Osiris praise someone with such a bright and joyful smile. He also told Vikir that he had a poker face just like his brother Osiris, then asked if by any chance he knew his older brothers. Vikir looked at him somewhat confused and replied that he was very aware of who his brothers were. Set looked at him, and with a joyful smile, he was glad that his younger brother knew him. He then explained that because he was very weak, he always stayed in the medical wing or at the isolation training hall. He also added that his training hall was very close to Underdog where Vikir was deputy consul. He planned to pay him a visit, so he asked if he could share his experience of the deep forest. Vikir, with a lost gaze, looked towards nothingness and thought that his bright attitude, which was very different from being a Baskerville, had not changed. During the fall, Vikir had the opportunity to serve under Set, so there were moments when they were together. In the midst of the chaos of battle, he was the only one who comforted the fallen bloodhounds. He even comforted Vikir, who was soaked in blood wandering through the battlefield. Even when Vikir was falsely accused, he remained by his side defending him until the end. With a cheerful smile, Set told Vikir that he would be under his care. Set was the only person Vikir wanted to meet at this banquet. At that moment, Vikir's expression changed drastically as he began to smell a disgusting stench that had been lingering since before. This repugnant odor was something only he could sense, as it had been present during the fall. This repugnant odor was the smell of demon. He quickly realized there was a hidden demon among the people present at the grand banquet. Vikir looked at everyone and started wondering where the source of this disgusting stench was. He closed his eyes, and after several seconds he opened them again and stared at a person. This person was holding his wine glass. He was Set, who had demon hands covering his body. He stared intently and with a smile asked Vikir, "Is there something you need?" This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.